Ismail Ibrahim. At 84, he had run a long race, having sacrificed the joys of a carefree youth and much of his adult life to embrace the anti-apartheid cause. Most of those 8 decades was spent educating himself about the struggle, leaving his family behind, dodging the apartheid police by crossing back and forth into South Africa, into Swaziland, Maputo, and Zambia, facing arrest, detention, torture during interrogation, trial and imprisonment, twice over on Robben Island. But as you know, he eventually emerged victorious. He took his place in democratic South Africa as a deputy minister, and he became an international conflict resolution figure whose influence was felt in Burundi, Bolivia, Sri Lanka, and Nepal, among others. Most importantly, at this stage, he also became a husband and a father. This book launch is unusual for me because in the natural course of things, I would usually be sitting here speaking to the author of this book. We'd be speaking about his life and his story as set out in Beyond Fear. But sadly, although Ebrahim Ebrahim is no longer with us, over the course of several of these book launches of his memoir, his dedicated wife, Shannon, has brought together many of EB's colleagues, his friends, and his comrades to tell his story in a way that momentarily resurrects him as we speak about him. Thank you very much for being here, Mr. President, to share in that. It really is lovely to have you on the panel. Shannon and Mohammed, thank you for the stories about EB that you are about to share. And what better way to share those stories and to begin than by asking his beautiful daughter, Sarah, to come up to read an extract of her father's book for us. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Taken from the chapter about Ebrahim's treason trial, recounting the day of his sentencing in 1989. I remembered something my interrogator, Nicholas Dietliefs, had said to me in John Foster Square when he bragged that the ANC and MK were being destroyed. "We will get you, one by one," he hissed. "We will rule this country for another 200 years. Yet on the day of our sentencing, our people were openly showing the victory salute and singing in defiance of the apartheid state in court. Dietliefs wasn't blind, he could see the end. He wasn't deaf, he could hear the triumph in their voices. I wrote a 17-page statement, which I used to address the court from the dock. As I started speaking, I realized I couldn't have cared less about Dietliefs. In my address, I said to the court, "We are certain that this court will decide to impose on us various sentences, though we shall condemn it as a perpetuation of the system of injustice to which millions of our people are subject. We do not fear such an outcome. To fear it would mean that when we join the struggle for the emancipation of our people, we do not understand the nature of the enemy we have to confront. But we know who it is that we, the rest of the freedom-loving people of our country, have to fight to turn into reality the dream of a South Africa that shall belong to both black and white. We have brushed shoulders with the angels of death who guard the king and princes that occupy the apartheid throne. In their hands they carry the gun, the hangman's noose, and vile instruments of torture. We know that the throne they defend can only stand if it is surrounded by a moat of human suffering."
Sarah, thank you so much for that and what you and your brother Caden are doing to keep your father's legacy alive. So let me introduce you to the panel once again. Mr. President, I don't think you need any introduction, actually. What I do want to say for the purposes of this discussion is that you were on Robben Island with Ebrahim during his first sentence, 15 years, a very, very arduous time. And I do want to explore that a little bit with you to give us a clearer picture, perhaps, of what that time on Robben Island was like. Many of you already know Shannon Ibrahim. She's in her own right an accomplished writer, researcher, journalist, and also the wife of Ebrahim and mother to their children, Sarah and Caden. And she too had a hand in the making of this book in its formative years. Mohammed Bhabha and Ibrahim were very close friends, and their friendship, as you will hear, stems from a dark time in Ibrahim's life in the 80s when Mohammed was able to reach out to him because of Mohammed's background as an attorney during that time. They did much of their conflict resolution work together in recent years, so that's a lovely facet of his life that we're about to hear about as well. But I wanted to start off with this title, Beyond Fear. It really gave me pause because of what it evokes. And Albie Sachs wrote a beautiful foreword in which he asks, what is fear? Should we even be beyond fear? Isn't fear part of life, part of our inbuilt physiological defense system to alert us to real and imminent danger, part of acknowledging our humanity? And yet we have before us the story of a human being who breached those boundaries of fear. And Mr. President, I'd like to hear from you, first of all. How do you think Ibrahim and others like you overcame that fear to fight for the liberation of our country?
Well, all those who, took part in the struggle against apartheid knew that there was always a risk of one being arrested or maimed or driven into exile. And so you had to overcome the torture of such thoughts. And we're all driven by, eternal hope and optimism that we were going to overcome. And I recall when the prison authorities were introducing any improvement on the physical structure of prison, we would look at it and conclude that, they are preparing this for themselves, actually, because we were in no doubt that the course we were pursuing was going to triumph, because their entire edifice was based on a lie, actually. And so we, in a sense, represented the future and represented the truth. Because the Nationalist Party were admirers of the Nazis. And in their overall approach, they also were trying to work out the final solution. And hence they were able to create Bantustans and so on. Just to give you a sense, of their frame of mind. So prisoners in South Africa, the white prisoners were kept in Pretoria. They were never sent to Robben Island. Yeah. And the black prisoners were sent to Robben Island. But even within the black prisoners, there was a grading system. So the diet, for instance, for fellow prisoners who were of Indian origin or colored, so-called, and so they were entitled to what was classified as D diet. And the Africans were categorized as those prisoners who should be given F diet. And I'll tell you the difference in a jiffy. So for breakfast, the Africans would be fed soft porridge, maize porridge, with a mug of coffee, pre-sweetened coffee. So somebody else puts the sugar in the coffee and stirs it. And if they feel it is sweet enough, that's good enough for the African prisoners. The Indian and colored prisoners would be given a quarter loaf of bread, brown bread, with a mug of coffee and milk, as well as sugar, brown sugar, in a spoon. So their coffee was not pre-sweetened. And then, so you see these African prisoners, they taste the coffee, and the soft porridge, maize porridge, is tasteless, so they pour the coffee onto, I don't know whether to sweeten the porridge or what, but it was quite a sight, you see. And then for lunch, the Africans get boiled millet, which is hard, really dry, so it's boiled. So you get 3/4 of a mug of these boiled millets. And I remember we waged a struggle to demand that the mug should be full, not 3/4. But I can tell you, when you are done with these 3/4, you don't want anything else, because your jaws are all completely exhausted. So the Indian and colored prisoners will then be served mealy rice or white samp. Of course, no embellishment, as dry as that. Then for supper, the Indian and colored prisoners, once again, they are given a quarter loaf of bread with a mug of meat. And it, of course, on different days, there were, on certain days, for supper, you'd get, so the Africans get, once again, soft porridge. On the best days would be when they give you soft porridge with a boiled egg and a raw carrot or tulip. So that were the best days. On other days, it's a head of a fish. So they take the body of the fish and they cook the heads. So you see, in a mug, you end up with a head of a fish. So that's how far they went to emphasize this grading system. And then, of course, in the early days, each prisoner would be entitled to one letter outgoing and one letter incoming for a semester. So if a relative passes on in March and you've already received your first quota of a letter, and the next one arrives informing you, they'll give it to you in July, because your quota is already exhausted. And of course, it was through the representations and interventions of the International Committee of the Red Cross, which paid us a visit once each year. And ahead of that, they would send the Deputy Commissioner of Prisons to come and collect whatever grievances or requests or demands that you have. And so over time, the quota of letters increased, but they do that as part of privileges. So they want to, every year you have to appear before the prison board with the which is chaired by the Deputy Commissioner of Prisons, and they look at you and they want to see that thing in your eyes which says this is a broken soul, and then they grade you. You see, so they improve on your grades and so on. So many prisoners remained at the lowest grade. And over time, of course, the International Committee of the Red Cross would intervene, and they had subtle ways of conveying the messages to these authorities.
Yes, yes.
They would say, no, we come here, we are from such and such a country, and the former leaders are now in prison. That's how they used to, subtly communicate to the authorities that, one day you may be prisoners. So be careful, what you do. So once in a while, I remember one occasion, they dumped boxes of overripe guavas. So in each cell, there's like 8 boxes of, and on average, a cell had about, in the communal cells, 32, 36 prisoners. So you'll have boxes of overripe guavas. And they can only last you 2 days because anyway, they are all done by the time. But for the 2 days, the entire atmosphere has a wonderful flavored, guava flavored environment.
It's amazing, Mr. President.
And down the line, when the International Committee of the Red Cross arrives, they say in their reports that each prisoner is given 1 fruit every day. 1 fruit. But the fruits would have arrived once, for boxes here. So and the other thing, so they would bring a projector on a Saturday. So they would move from one section to another with a projector. It's a projector, the film is made up of 5 reels. So these warders don't care. So he loads there, and it's rim 2. So you don't know where this story comes from. And then it carries on, and then rim 3, and then rim 1. Then it starts. And rim, then it ends, and then rim 4 follows. They don't want bloody well can they peg them, they go to the next section. Even there, they just load them like that. So we had experts among the prisoners. Now remember, some of the prisoners were not cinema goers per se. So even when a movie is properly sequenced, they wouldn't know how to follow the story. It's worse when it is all mixed up. But after lockup, so we had experts, you see, after lockup who were able to then, interpret and explain what the movie was all about. And listening to them, was far better than watching
it out of sequence. Shannon, Mr. President here is making light of some of the more enjoyable, perhaps, or more bearable aspects, I should say, of being on Robben Island. There can't have been anything enjoyable about it at all. But did EB relate to you some of the awful experiences that he had there and that stayed with him on the island, Shannon?
Thanks, Joanne. Yes, I think we visited Robben Island almost every year for the last 20 years. So, and EB liked it to bring people and tell them the stories. And I think my favorite story, because it presents such an image in my mind, is when, in those early years especially, there was no toilet paper, there was no tissues. And can you imagine the prisoners in the quarry, especially the ones who were not in the lime quarry, but the stone quarry, as you were, being exposed to that icy, cold Cape Town wind and having such inadequate clothing that they even had to take sacks and try to make like a vest so that they would get just a slight more covering from the cold. And it was always a fight to try and put up a shelter to block the wind, and then the warders would take the shelters down. And it says in the book there was a big altercation between the prison authorities and the prisoners. So anyway, a lot of them would get sick with colds and flu. And I believe in the early days, there was a hunger strike to try and get something to blow their nose because they were perpetually ill and there wasn't very good medical care. So after this hunger strike, the authorities capitulate and they decide to get a big piece of red material. And then this is the story I call the Red Handkerchief. So they cut the red material into these strips. So each prisoner got a strip. And then they would wash this strip at the end of the day in the shower or in the basin. And then they hung these strips to dry on the cell grill. And at the end of a week, Major Kellerman, who was the head warder or the prison commander, he comes and he starts to lose his mind. And he said, "The prisoners have tricked us. They're flying the red flag. Take it all down. Take it all down." And that was the end of the handkerchiefs. And I mean, it's funny, but it's also a story of utter deprivation. I remember, like during COVID's, complaining how, expensive everything had become and toilet paper. We're stocking up on toilet paper. And Ibi says, he would always come out with these little vignettes here and there. And he'd say, in the early days, we had no toilet paper. Yep. We would have to tear pieces of cement bag from around the prison and leaves and use that. I mean, we can't even imagine that level of deprivation on the island. And even just the way that people were sleeping. Ibi said when he first arrived, it was before Madiba in 1964, they were sleeping 80 to a cell, sleeping on the cement floor on scratchy sisal mats, each person with 3 threadbare blankets. Yep. And always, freezing cold. They never had underwear. They never had pajamas. So actually they slept with nothing because they didn't want to sleep in their dirty work clothes. And their work clothes from the quarry only got washed on a Saturday. So every day they wore the same clothes. So if that can just paint a picture, Joanne, of just what it must have been like, I think it was a very hard existence.
Mm. Mohammed, I get the sense that on the one hand, Ibrahim was fiercely dedicated to the struggle and he was prepared to give a lot up for the sake of the struggle. But part of that sacrifice involved literally abandoning his family, going into hiding several times, crossing the border several times. His family had no idea where he was. He couldn't communicate with them. Some of the information that they got about his whereabouts came out in the papers when he was arrested, And I can't forget that pathetic picture of his mother and father standing outside the court when he was sentenced the first time, that look of complete and utter devastation on their faces. I mean, that must have been a very difficult paradox for him to handle. On the one hand, his dedication to the family of South Africans, while having to abandon his own. Mohammed?
Thanks, Joanne. My interactions with Ibrahim, it always manifests itself. There was a sense of guilt in him. And he tried to compensate in the way he interacted with Shannon, with Sarah, with Caden. It was almost as if he was overcompensating. Now, it could have been true love, it was definitely, but there was a lot more. And I can imagine this working class family living in abject poverty. And 2 of the brothers, Gora, and go and work to put food on the table. So much more pressure on Gora and Ibrahim, and yet they joined the struggle. Internally, they must have been torn apart. On the one hand, their conviction to the movement to overthrow apartheid, and on the other hand, to abandon, in inverted commas, their family. It must have been extremely difficult. But in all my interactions post the unbanning of the ANC and the dedication to the family, and whether it was his sister, his nieces, it was always as if he was trying to catch up. And this balance of guilt and conviction always came to the fore.
Shannon, I think part of that, which is very evident in the book, are these shifting notions of home. He doesn't have a definition of home per se for several decades in his life. He doesn't stay with his parents. He stays with his grandmother. He's very close to. And then all of a sudden he's involved in the struggle. And then he is moving about constantly, and he is in safe houses, and he is traveling across borders, and he is running from the apartheid police. And then, of course, his home becomes prison. He is in John Forster, his home is on Robben Island, he is at Leeuwkop prison. I mean, I think for the first time in his life, the notion of home, the real definition of home, came to the fore when he met you and when he married you and had children with you. Just tell me a little bit about that aspect of him and how that crystallized so late in his life.
Well, it is true what you're saying. So he never really had a sense of home. And, you know, Ronnie Castro says when they were young saboteurs and they were planting bombs to blow up pylons in Durban in 1962, 63, there's a part in the book which says, every day I was going around looking for a place to stay, no money for transport, no money for food. It was almost as if we had been abandoned, because this was the days where you just had to fend for yourself. So Ronnie had found a house in Kloof, north of Durban, and it belonged to Eleanor's parents. And so they moved in there so they could put the dynamite in the garage. And, you know, Ronnie told me the other day that in the book he's reading that Ibi never had a bath in a bathtub until he was 25 in that house. He had always bathed in a drum of water. And he said, it's funny, you know, Ibi never even told me that he had been brought up in such poverty. And it was in that house they had to, you know, feed themselves. That's where their MK unit was based. And then it wasn't long before they ended up being caught. Well, Ibi was caught and went to Robben Island. And then, you know, that theme sort of carries on. And I remember after he had spent 15 years on the island to the last day, he's now banned and restricted in Durban. And he's only there like about a year and a half before he gets, and actually a friend of mine in Durban, Fatima Mir's niece, told me last week, you know, I met a young woman, a friend of mine in Durban, and she said, Ibi used to stay at the Ashoka Hotel in Durban because he managed to convince them to allow him to move from Fatima's parents' house in Reservoir Hills to the Ashoka Hotel, so that he could have all his secret meetings with the underground. And that this woman was a young girl, and her father owned the hotel. And she said to her dad, I always see this man, he's always alone, and doesn't he have family? He looks so lonely. And even that existence of being in this probably 2-star hotel, he was always alone. And then he gets a call one day that he must rush to meet someone for coffee. He's being spirited out of the country. And this was on the instructions of O.R. Tambo in, I think it was about 1980, 81, because someone who had befriended him ended up being an agent, and he was about to be exposed and handed over to the security police. So he meets a comrade who immediately, within an hour, he was gone. I don't know what, he probably took nothing with him. He was taken over across the border into Swaziland, and it opens a whole new chapter in his life. And I should mention, in Swaziland, he said every 6 months he was living in a different underground house. So he'd get used to a house, get used to the environment, then they'd have to change. Because that area of Swaziland in the 80s was the hunting ground of Eugene de Kock and his hit squads. And his comrades like Shadrach Mapumulo and many of the people that he was close to were shot and killed in Swaziland. So I don't know, Ibi was very casual. I don't know if he took all the security precautions, but they were always looking over their back. And that's a horrible way to have existed. So it's true, you know, when I first met him, he said he had had this dream before we had got married that he was sleeping in the side of the street with me, and he went to this grandmother who had died when he was 14, and in the dream he was saying, Ma, where am I going to take her to live with me, because I have no home. So even as a 60-something-year-old, he still didn't have a sense of where was his home exactly. So I guess I feel lucky to have been with him, and he was lucky that he got a second chance at life. Sarah was born when he was 69, and Caden, who's not well tonight, he's not here, was born when he was 71. And that's why this extreme love for his children and his family. He had never had furniture, he'd never owned pots or towels, and it was wonderful that he could experience that later in life.
Mr. President, I mean, one of the most difficult things about the book is that it reminds us about the kind of torture that occurred, torture in detention, psychological torture, physical torture, the many people who were broken by that torture, some of whom turned their back on their colleagues and comrades, some of whom turned apartheid state witness, essentially, and testified against their own friends and people they had considered brothers and sisters in the past. Of course, Shannon there mentions Shadrach Mapumulo, who was extremely close to Ibi, and he was broken by Shadrach's death. So much happened during that time, and it happened over a series of decades, despite your optimism, despite that goal being something so visible to you in the future. It was a long, hard, arduous, painful, tragic, traumatic road getting there. How did you people like you and Ibi emerge from this experience without bitterness?
Well, as I said, we were optimists, eternal optimists. I mean, we believed that, our cause was going to triumph.
But you were encountering violent human beings who dehumanized you, who humiliated you, who treated you as if you were less than human.
Yes.
How did you overcome that natural human emotion towards hatred for those individuals and their system?
Yeah. Well, Harry Gwala used to explain that to us, that when a postman on a bicycle rides down the street delivering telegrams and so on, and dogs and puppies chase after the bicycle, you'll never see that postman park the bicycle and go on all fours and start barking back at the dogs. So he says, people will, passers-by will say, well, there's a dog fight taking place there. So we, in a sense, knew our cause and knew that these people who have their jackboots on our necks do so because they themselves are driven by fear. They are gripped by fear. They know that tomorrow does not belong to them. So we had to show moral ascendancy, and our humanity always helped us go through those difficult moments. And some of them, we had prison warders who had 2 years stints on the island. Some of them would arrive very young, and just by ensuring that we interact with them as human beings. So you greet them, you show them respect without kowtowing to them at all. So we had fit fellow prisoners, because we trained and all of that. And then we would select after 1976. So we choose the one with the smallest body, and we make him the commander of the work team. So when we go out, he's the one who goes to the warders and says, these men are under my command. And at a certain point, I'm going to detail 2 of them to go out at sea and get some mussels. And then they are entitled to a smoke break. And so these warders were completely confused by, that these people are supposed to be dangerous, terrorists. That's how they are told. And then they are under the command of this one. So it means he's the most dangerous one. And we had fun, because the point I'm making is that once we understood why they were behaving and thinking the way they were doing, we took control. So we were in control of those situations. But of course, you know, we also had philosophers amongst us. So if you share with your fellow prisoners that, no, we were tortured. What did they do to you? They did this and that and that and so on, and you describe the torture. And the philosophers say to you, that's not torture. They were assaulting you. You were beaten up. That's not torture. And they explain that, look, torture is when they put a big lens on the table and they ask you questions, and they put a hood over your head, and you've seen the big rod, and once they put a hood over your head, without using it, you already anticipate that, is it going to land on my head or which part of the body? And so the philosophers explain that is torture. When they actually beat you up, that's assault. They are actually beating you up. It's not torture. So,
did that make a difference?
Well, no. I mean, you're sentenced to 10 years. You serve it to the last day. There's no remission. There's no parole. There's nothing. So you have all the time to wade through that period. And that is why we had no access to newspapers, we had no access to radio. They had, piped music in the cell. So there's a speaker, and they control it from the censorship office. And so the speaker is also listening to the discussion. So Big Brother is always listening. So you had to ensure that your discussions don't mention names that would endanger the safety of people who are outside. But other than that, so if you find a newspaper, it didn't matter whether it is 2 months old, as long as it has news, it's important. And there's a way in which it would be circulated. And once in a while, you get a warder who is about to leave, to be transferred. His 2 years stint has come to an end, and he has a transistor radio. So he passes it on, and so you keep it out there, and at a certain point, the commander will say to the warder, so and so must go out there to get some muscles. Meanwhile, you're going to listen to the news at a certain time. That man there in a cap, Paul Langer, was in charge of one such radio. And the authorities get to know, and they conduct a search, a strip search. So they search for and they impound whatever they find, which they regard as contraband, which includes political education notes, because those who were registered to study would go through the recommended books and order them from the UNISA library and so on. And the day it arrives, there are people who were known to have legible handwritings. And so they sit down non-stop to copy the entire book with pages and footnotes and everything in a 3-quire notebook. And there are others who must then duplicate that. So the main copy has to go and be buried elsewhere, because from periodically there are strip searches and they take everything. the beauty about them is that they had no understanding of what real politics are. So they look for anything that says black, white, that they take away. So these, books by Conforth on historical and dialectical materialism, now they put them aside. They are not political, which was wonderful. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Mohammed, I want to ask you about what we know was a very difficult period in Ibrahim's life. And I'm talking about the period when he was charged with high treason along to other people in 1989. He was facing the death penalty at that time. And you came into contact with him for the first time during that period. What were your interactions like at that critical time?
So because I was an attorney practicing in the area, after he was kidnapped, he went to trial in a town called Bethal. That's where the potato boycotts the potato repression took place. So I had access to the cells. And Ibrahim and his two co-accused used to be there. And my wife Rabia and I used to take food for him. And I was quite young. And I think I very innocently asked him, because Ibrahim was on the eve of his judgment. He clearly was facing the very real possibility of the death sentence. And I asked him, I said, Ibrahim, if you were to look back into your life, any regrets? And he told my wife and I regret nothing. And if I were to have an opportunity again, I'd do exactly the same thing. But with a sense of pride and a sense of victory. It wasn't, you're not seeing a downtrodden person. And I'm not surprised the speech that Sarah read was the next day in Bethal at the I'm not surprised that he said what he said. But I did not see a defeated man. And such was his conviction that he said, I'll do it all over again. There was a sense of spirituality at the time. And my wife and I then brought an imam there just to sort of try and pacify him, or just some sort of peace in the area, or in the cell. But that left an indelible mark in my mind. Remarkable, facing the death sentence, and you say these things.
It's amazing, Mohammed, that one of the things that he found most offensive was that he had been accused of placing bombs or landmines in a context where children were injured. Yeah. And why did that offend him so?
So in the trial itself, there was this Mr. X who had betrayed them. And they had trumped up charges, creating this picture that he was this commander that had put bombs. And in the areas I came from, farmers used to drop their children off, and then the yellow bus comes and fetches them. And he was essentially accused of having put the bombs there and killed landmines, and children died. When I spoke to Ibrahim about it, I think he wasn't as much offended or affected by the fact that he was betrayed by this Mr. X. What hurt him more was that Mr. X actually said that he was capable of killing children. It was just not him. And that he found extremely offensive. It hurt him. It hurt him badly.
And in later years, Shannon, you must have interacted with him quite a lot over this issue. Was there a disappointment towards the end as to what had become of the ANC government, the rampant corruption, the dishonesty, the betrayal of the South African people in so many ways? How did he feel about that? Did he ever speak to you about it?
I think at the beginning, when it started to come out that, this layers of corruption was there, he didn't want to believe it, because he himself was so incorruptible. And he had been offered things, and he would just look at people strangely, like, because he was just not motivated by money. And I think he didn't want to believe it. And he said, well, if there's evidence, the evidence must come out. But it was in this last year that he had cancer that he listened to the Zondo Commission. And I watched him sitting on the couch day after day. And he would just have this blank stare on his face. And you would try to probe, can you believe this? Do you know what? How can you imagine these people have done this? He couldn't talk about it. The depths of his disappointment and disillusionment was just so much that he couldn't discuss it. I guess because for them, as he says at the end of the book on Robben Island, they were fighting for a more equal society, for a government that will deliver to its people. And that's what he so respected about Comrade Halima, because they had the same set of values and principles. And the idea that people could just be now for themselves, and not everyone, but there are a number of people, I think he was very, very sad. But he was also, as we've discussed, an eternal optimist. And he would always say, when someone would ask him at a dinner party, he'd say, you know what? We have been through far worse in this country and in our struggle than what we're going through now. We have the capacity to change things for the better, but we have to root out the corruption and we have to renew ourselves. And that is my great hope. I'm sure you share that we renew the party that brought us this amazing freedom, but also understanding that the World Bank has declared South Africa the most unequal society in the world. So if that was the goal they were fighting for, there is still a struggle. And I met a teacher in my son's school this week. About the principal had read this book and he was really impressed, and he wants to change the way we teach apartheid in schools. And he made me meet the head of the history department, and he's a young African guy, and he said, we have matric students coming out who know nothing about MK, who know nothing about the struggle. There's something wrong with our curriculum and what we're doing. So I know one of Ibi's comrades, Shirish Soni, who was tortured when they were looking for Ibi in 1985. He was tortured with the Sheikh brothers. He started this campaign to challenge business people, buy 20 books or more, and we will make sure they're distributed to schools and universities. And if every businessman took up that challenge, I think we can start changing the mindsets and inspiring our young people that we do have the capability of making a better South Africa.
Yeah. And that segues so well to my next question, and perhaps this will be my final question, Mr. President. Yeah. There are so many young people in the country who are angry. They are hungry, they have no opportunities, they lack the future that they were promised, and that their parents hoped would become a reality when the democratic dispensation came. They're angry with you and they're angry with your colleagues in the ANC. But they also do not have a sense of history. They do not remember the stories of your struggle. They are highly critical of you, partly because they don't really know. They don't have that institutional memory because of when they were born, and they don't really know what you did to liberate the struggle, the country from this dispensation, and how you sacrificed essentially decades of your lives, your personal lives, your family lives, everything that you could have been, to spend time in prison for justice in the long term. How do we reconcile the two? The current anger, which is justified, with the past that you have sacrificed in order to make equality possible in this country?
Yeah, well, the late Professor Kiurapet Nkosazana was a poet. So he writes in one of his poems entitled, "The present is a dangerous place to live." So it's got a sentence in it. He writes the words past, present, future as one word. And he says past, present, future is always now. So when we interact with history, history gives us context, why certain things happened the way they did. And so we must guard against becoming prisoners of history. Because when you attach too much value in the good old days, you are a conservative because you are conserving the good old days. Whereas the correct approach is to draw lessons from the past so that we equal the challenges of the present and resolve them in a manner which lays down a solid foundation for the future. So there's no Chinese wall which separates the past from the present and the future. It's a continuum. And so young people can only benefit from history if they draw lessons from that. And play their role in ensuring that today's problems are resolved in a manner which creates a better future. And so each generation has to work out what its historical mission is for itself. Yeah. No amount of finger pointing will resolve the problems. The problems have to be confronted and resolved in a manner, and that it's everybody's responsibility. Because once you present yourself as a victim, you remain a victim forever. I mean, you would not be able to solve any problem. And if you have no sense of solidarity, if you can't help the next person, you will not be able to help yourself when you are confronted by difficulties. So I have lots of time for young people. I met some young, interesting people who said to me, they said to me, look, we will no longer criticize the ANC because we think the ANC does that far much better than we can do through its pronouncements and its actions. So we're not going to waste our brain power in criticizing the ANC. We will use our brain power to identify problems and develop, work out solutions to those problems. So I go back to my ANC comrades and I say, man, these chaps say we are so bad that as critics they are pleading for mercy. So it's an interesting attitude that they displayed, that they will utilize their brain power more productively, and they think the ANC is so hopeless that it's not worth criticizing. Yeah.
I'm not going to ask you if you think they're right, Mr. President.
Well, they have the right to say that, and that right I respect. Yeah.
It's the joy of democracy.
Yeah.
Can we please take some questions from the audience? And we're going to try and get a mic to you so that you can ask your questions to the panel. But I know, Shannon, you very much wanted to pay tribute to Janet Smith, who was so important in crafting this book, Beyond Fear. And do you want to quickly just tell us what Janet's role was in this book?
Yes, Ibi started writing this book, I think it was when I first met him around to 1999 or so. And over many years, he's developed this manuscript. But, Ibi wasn't a writer, and it was a little bit on the dry side. And so we asked Janet to meet us one day at Paul's Cafe, a very elitist place in Melrose Arch. And we said, Janet, you're the best writer that we know. We need your help, because we need people to read this book and to love this book and to feel that they're part of the story. And all I can say is, Janet, this would not be the book it is today without you. And I so appreciate this. And Janet did this without an expectation of anything. And for 7 months, she worked on this book. And I'm so proud and to call you my friend. And I want to say a very big thank you. Can we give her a round of applause? And I also just wanted to recognize that, as you mentioned, President, we have Paul Langer here. And I had asked him if he could share with us a little bit of his stories. You'll see in the book, there's a lovely picture of a comrade with Ibi, and he's in Robben Island, and he's handing Ibi the key. There was only one master key of the island. They're laughing, and he's handing him the key because he was in charge of taking tours at that time on Robben Island as being with the ANC. So, Paul, welcome, and we'd love to hear you also make a few contributions.
Paul, I can't quite see you. Do you have the mic? Okay, there we go. We're bringing you a mic, Paul.
Excellency, the leaders are here. So after they've spoken, it's very difficult.
Paul. Okay, who else do you see, Mr. President?
Peter Paul Ngwenya.
Peter Paul Ngwenya. Can we hear from you briefly, please, on behalf of Paul as well?
I have both names. I'm Peter Paul.
Yes.
My name is Peter Paul Ngwenya. Yes, when EB came to Robben Island for the second time, he found me there. And we got the message, and then he came to live in our section, Section B. We got a message through the grapevine that from now on, he is the head of Robben Island. In other words, we will be taking instructions from him. But had we not heard that, we would never have thought that EB had been directed by Nelson Mandela to lead the ANC on Robben Island. There's one thing that stands out for me with EB. During Ramadan, all those comrades that were Muslims, they would receive food. It would be prepared from Cape Town by the likes of Trevor Manuel and delivered on Robben Island. Now, in our section, there were only 3 Muslims, and there were 22 of us. If we would order food, because this food is delivered every day, he would order food that would feed 50 people for that one. And then he would just take a portion that he has to eat when he breaks his fast, and another portion that he will take just before daylight the following day. Then the rest of us would feed on this. We would feed on the food that he has organized. And then he was doing this because EB was feeling quite guilty that during this period, we were still restricted to prison food, and they were getting food from the mainland, which was really, because everybody of you know how well those people from Cape Town can cook. So all of us were looking forward to Ramadan. It was just the thing that I always remember. And then, of course, when we were about to be released, I think I was amongst the last one to be released. The last prisoner was going to be released on the 30th of April, 1991. I was released on the 16th of April, 1991. So we knew that the Christmas of 1990 was going to be the last Christmas for us. So we asked the authorities that, can we have what you could call the Last Supper? They agreed, and then they said we must give them a list of everything that you wanted. And then there was a comrade, his name is Rafiq Rohan, who was a great cook. So he prepared a list of all the ingredients that we needed for that. And we had such a wonderful time. And the authorities offered, because I was the one who was negotiating, they offered that you could have wine as well if you so wish. So I told the comrades, they said, no. The next thing, after we've been released, people are going to say, we're sitting here and drinking wine all the way through. So we declined the request. Thank you.
Beautiful memories. Thank you very much for that. Are there any other questions? Yes, we've got a question there. Just pass the mic through. Thank you.
Yeah,
Donovan.
I just want to know, because I've only got the book now, and I shall definitely read it. And it's something what President Matlante was raising about being a prisoner of history. And we're supposed to learn from history. And as much as I want to learn about those difficult times of apartheid, I also hope the book would be able to reflect on the time of Comrade Ibi's time in government, and also after government, when he worked with internationally, where, I mean, the thing about Comrade Ibi, and everybody says how humble he is, but he really was. I remembered asking him, just by fluke that I met him, and I asked him, I said, hey, I see you know Evo Morales. How did you meet Evo Morales? And he starts to explain, in his matter-of-fact way of how he was noticing what was going on there and in Bolivia, and he just took a trip and contacted him, and nobody was taking notice of this guy, and he went there, and how when he went with an aeroplane there, and Morales was now elected president, he was on the tarmac waiting to greet him, waiting to meet with him, and when he goes there, he knows, and it would have been easy for Comrade Ibi, being of Islamic faith, to take up Palestine and Israel, to take up that conflict. But he didn't do that. He didn't segment himself, and he never blew his trumpet about knowing the president of this country or being called by the Spanish club to talk about matters, or Nepal and so forth. And I'm really hopeful that that international solidarity work he did, what he was so humble about, is also taken up, but also that the book reflects on that it didn't stop him from doing that. He would draft things in his own handwriting and come through about many things. And the last couple of years, and I'm sure, Shannon, you'll be able to, that he was taking up Zimbabwe in his own way. He was literally doing it by himself. Didn't matter who supported him or whatever. He really believed in peace, and that you build peace from below. So I'm really, really hopeful that the book has that we don't become prisoners of just history and nostalgic, but we are able to learn from his belief in peace and the belief of building a better life. Thank you.
So Donovan, that's a fantastic point. And towards the end of the book, he does actually deal with that. Not at length, but Mohammed, can you just expand a little bit on that for us? Because you were part of the NGO that traveled with him. Can we just have Mohammed's mic?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Ibrahim, Rolf Meyer, Ivor Jenkins, and I formed an NGO around 2013, particularly around the Sri Lankan conflict. And it's ironical that you mentioned Palestine. Whatever Ibrahim's views were, we had discussions with all sections. On the Israeli side, the different factions in Israel, the different factions. There's one thing that came out there. Ibrahim never judged. In his entire life, he always believed that we are products of our circumstances. And it was driven by two values. I was sitting with him in Havana when we met FARC. I think Judge Sex was with us as well. And we met the FARC rebels that had come out of the forests. Of Colombia, yes, of course. And even there, whatever he said was underpinned by two things. It was value-driven, and it was underpinned with human rights. The story, President, you talk about the dog and the lesson he told us is never reduce yourself to the level of your enemy. Your fight would not be worth it. And I think I'll just share this with you, Joanne. I think it is Rumi that said it, I may be wrong, that, a candle shines furthest away, just below the candle, it's darkest. And I always thought of Ibi like that. He wasn't appreciated enough in this country for his contribution. But I was sitting in Palestine with him, no matter which faction it was, they all stood up for him in respect. 1 week after his death, I was sitting in Bangui in Central African Republic. And you want to talk about commitment. At the age of 82, we were sitting in Bangui, we didn't have water for a week. And he took it in his stride. But a week after he passed, I was sitting in Bangui. In the remotest part of Africa, people stood up in attention and mourned his death. And I always felt the tragedy is he wasn't recognized enough in this country. But everywhere else, that light shone. I could give you anecdotes like that, or there's so many of them, with the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. But there was one thing that was quite certain. This man commanded respect from everybody we met.
Yes. Okay, I'll take you next, Solly. Can we have a question at the back? Or where is the mic, actually? That might be the most efficient thing to do. Our roving mic. Where is it right now? Okay, there we go.
Thank you.
you.
So, Mr. President and Shannon, I think you touched the issue a little bit. I want you to elaborate a little bit on his way of activism. So you are comrades, you know his way of activism, maybe you share the same vision, but I personally learned about his way of activism by reading his book. But how can we, or how shall we translate his way of activism, his passion, his faith, his hope, his resilience into our current South African situation and in the world?
It's an excellent question.
That's an excellent question.
Do you have?
Shall I
okay, you
defer
start
to
with
the
that.
politician and our leader, please?
Yeah. Well, EB was a just person, and as Mohammed Bhabha has indicated, never judged anybody. And he had his own quiet way of making time to engage anybody. If he felt that, there's an issue about you, he would engage you. And that's how, in doing his international work, he went. They dealt with the Tamil Tigers. He would go to Bolivia and try and understand the cause of the natives in Bolivia who were basically farm workers, and they chew coca leaves, and the ladies there wear these small bowler hats, delicately patched on the head, and they are hands-free because they tie a cloth around their neck, and whatever needs to be carried, they throw into this cloth around their neck. And Evo Morales came from that community. So when he was confirmed, because EB brought him here after he had won the elections, but he had not been inaugurated. So he had to go back to be inaugurated. After his inauguration, in the presidential house, he shared with his cabinet, those who didn't have places, shared the entire presidential house, the state house. So he was a down-to-earth person. And EB, I traveled with him to Bolivia, I traveled with him to Syria, Palestine, and he had a way of identifying an issue and identifying key interlocutors who he ought to engage. And that is why with Mohammed Bhabha and Rolf Meyer, they've done wonderful work internationally in conflict situations to intervene in a meaningful way. So even here at home, EB could relate to anybody. It didn't matter what their political affiliation and political party is. On specific issues, he could go quietly and engage with that person. So he was always enriched by the perspectives and views of those he engaged with. And I think they also benefited a great deal from that. He was not a rah-rah person or someone who'd blow his horn and trumpet and so on. No, he did his work quietly and understood that real work is work that ends no remark, actually. Yeah.
Lots to be learned from that. Do we have, Solly, we had a question that you wanted to ask. Just going to bring the mic round to you. Thanks, Solly.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks to the panel for insightful engagement with the life of Comrade EB. Partly my question was answered by the last two speakers, Comrade Bhabha and the President, regarding his international work and his capacity to reach to most difficult areas. And I think there are areas that, for instance, are not so prominent even in our policy space, but every time we went there, we found that Comrade EB has already done some good groundwork. For instance, in East Timor, he did a lot of great work and supported Comrade Shannon Ibrahim in a most wonderful way, such that he was highly revered in that community. There's a freedom fighter, our freedom fighter, Comrade Jack Avenda, who died in Swaziland. His co-compatriot who got injured in that accident. He's been buried on Sunday. Comrade Amos Mbezi was motivated by him to reach out to the Fremantini group. When he came back, he gave a report to EB. Then EB mentioned the entire space about the world where critical conflicts are taking place and what their possible resolution means for those communities. And one of those was the FARC in Colombia. And, Jack became a changed person. We fundraised for him because he said he's going to work somewhere in the US. He found some job in the ships, but ultimately destination someplace in the US. But the main target was to go to Colombia. And because of how EP was able to put this question on the table. And I'm glad that finally, towards his end days, he was directly involved, also now bringing the state system, the NGOs, and all other main role players to the resolution of that country. And I think that's a major contribution that South Africa should not forget his contribution in this. And the last one was on Kurdistan. We were discussing one day about, we had launched a campaign for the support of Mumia Abu-Jamal in the US. And that campaign died down as well as the campaign of the support for Abdullah Öcalan in Turkey, who has been arrested by the Turkish government. And he was supposed to leave from Kenya to South Africa and was almost hijacked. And I know that a Turkmen who has given EB great support in this regard, but EB remained principled and actually reached out to the Kurdish people. And he facilitated my trip, for instance, to Kurdistan, to the liberated zones. When I arrived there, I arrived at a point, I think 2016 or so, President Mandela's film was just released. The entire camp was studying Mandela. But as we were studying Mandela, they were also studying EB, his contribution in the Tamil struggle and other conflicts. So he was a big hero. They called him Mandela's top warrior. And I came back to give him a feedback. On that basis, this matter, he managed it because I think at some point was too far ahead of the ANC in terms of policy space and where the ANC should be going in terms of humanism. And sometimes we felt that they were not ready. And he recommended the study group of the ANC to look into this Kurdish question and so forth. But finally, they had some discussion on. But he played a wonderful role. And I must say to Shannon, you have had a great companion and a wonderful comrade. His legacy will always be celebrated by all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Solly, that's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I think I'm going to make that our last question, our last contribution, because it's a beautiful way on a note on which to end this. I'm going to call it a kind of memorialization of someone who was really important to our democracy. We do not in South Africa memorialize the most important figures in our history enough. We don't speak about them often enough in the public domain. We don't always remember their contribution the way we should. And I think these events are always so important because, as I said, they're a form of resurrection for those individuals. And remembering, doing that hard memory work of what has happened in our society. And as President Motlanthe has said, drawing important lessons from that in the present actually becomes so important. And that's why these gatherings are so special, because they allow us to travel through time and space, to be able to glean those lessons. Ultimately, in my mind, Beyond Fear, which you must all pick up a copy of, please, is a book about love. It's a book about love for one's family, love for one's nation, love for one's compatriots, love for the principle of equality and dignity in the country. And I haven't, in fact, spoken about one of my favorite chapters, which was the love story between Shannon and Evie, which is a beautiful one. And Janet, I'm sure you'd agree with me. The rest of it is written in the tone of a mature political figure. And that chapter reads like a young man who's falling in love for the first time. So there are beautiful aspects about this book that will touch various different parts of your humanity. And so I urge you to get a copy of it. I want to thank you all for being a part of this tonight. Mr. President, thank you for joining us. It was wonderful to have your contribution and your personal experience with Ebrahim. Shannon, you've done a wonderful job of memorializing him. And wherever he is, for those of you who believe that he can see us from where he is, he must be very proud of what you have done to remember his life and contribution. Mohammed, thank you for remembering some of the more difficult parts of his life and reminding us of the contribution he made post-democracy, not just as a member of cabinet, but also as an internationalist and a conflict resolution specialist and a kind of quiet activist. And Shannon, what would you like to add?
I just wanted to add one last thing, one last appeal. This is our 6th book launch since May 5th. So we've been doing this around the country. And what I've noticed is that every book launch, we have wonderful people, but they're all about over 40 years old. And I think that's true tonight. And I think what Ibi would have loved more than anything else, and I'm sure you're each going to buy a book for yourselves, but if you could buy one book and give it to a young person that you think could be influenced by Ibi's story, that would be the greatest thing that you could have done for him.
Thank you very much for that, Shannon. Thank you, Sarah, for your contribution as well. And you remind us that the activism continues into the coming generations, and you are our hope, and your father would have been so proud to see you deliver that today. And of course, we miss your brother, Caden. Please give him our best as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Have a great evening and do travel home safely. And the signing will be over there. There's a huge shelf with lots of books on it. Please help yourselves. Thank you.